The lights inside the arena went black. For half a second, there was nothing. Then came the sound of a New York City subway train rolling through the speakers. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from. We want to see how far these stories are reaching. The crowd erupted before the lights even came back on. A single spotlight appeared in the center of the stage. Standing underneath it was Tony Roberts. But nobody inside that arena called him Tony. To the world, he was Brooklyn Slugga. 28 years old. Born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. 2 platinum albums. Millions of streams. Songs on radio stations across the country. Sold-out concerts. International tours. Brand deals. Real estate investments. And now he was standing on the Grammy stage. The beat dropped. Slugga lifted the microphone. The opening record was one of the biggest songs from his second album. Thousands of people stood. Celebrities danced in their seats. Slugga moved across the stage like he had been doing it his entire life. Then the beat changed. The giant screen behind him turned red. A woman's voice came through the speakers. The crowd screamed again. Sela stepped onto the stage. Sela was one of the other artists managed by James Draper's A1 Entertainment. She and Slugga had recorded a song together that had become one of the biggest collaborations of the year. She walked toward him as her verse began. Slugga smiled. They finished the record together. When the final beat stopped, the arena gave them a standing ovation. Slugga looked around. He had dreamed about moments like this since he was a teenager writing rhymes in Brooklyn. Tonight, the dream was real. And it wasn't finished. Later that evening, Tony sat beside his wife, Chrissy, waiting for the announcement for Best Rap Album. Chrissy squeezed his hand. "You got this." Tony smiled. "We got this." A few seats away sat James Draper. James was 32, from Newark, New Jersey, and the owner of A1 Entertainment. 4 years earlier, James had helped Tony get his first major recording contract. Tony never forgot that. When nobody knew Brooklyn Slugga, James knew. At least that was what Tony believed. The presenter opened the envelope. "And the Grammy goes to..." Tony leaned forward. "Brooklyn Slugga." Chrissy screamed. Dre jumped out of his seat. D-Nice grabbed Tony from behind. James stood clapping. Tony kissed Chrissy before walking toward the stage. He stared at the trophy after it was placed in his hand. For once, Brooklyn Slugga didn't have anything clever to say. "This is crazy." The audience laughed. Tony looked toward his people. "I used to record in my man's basement in Brooklyn. We had one microphone, and you had to hold the wire a certain way or it would cut off." The camera found D-Nice laughing. Tony pointed at him. "You remember?" D-Nice nodded. Tony continued. "I want to thank my wife, Chrissy. You've been there through all of this." The camera moved toward Chrissy. She smiled. "My brother Dre. D-Nice. Everybody who believed in me before anybody knew who Brooklyn Slugga was." Then Tony looked toward James. "And James Draper. A1 Entertainment. James helped a kid from Brooklyn get through doors I couldn't even get close to it." James nodded proudly. "And most importantly, the fans." Tony raised the Grammy. "Brooklyn, we got one." The arena erupted. Tony had no idea that the man he had just thanked had been making money from him in ways Tony didn't understand. He had no idea that his wife had been sleeping with that same man. And he certainly didn't understand that some of the music that had just earned him a Grammy didn't belong to him. Before the night was over, Tony returned to the stage. This time Sela stood beside him. They won Best Rap Collaboration. Grammy number 2. Backstage, photographers surrounded them. Tony held a Grammy in each hand. Sela stood on one side. Chrissy stood on the other. James stepped into the picture. Everybody smiled. Years later, Tony would look at that photograph differently. Almost everybody who had mattered during the most difficult period of his life was somewhere around him that night. Some would betray him. Some would protect him. And some would help him rebuild. But that night Tony only knew one thing. Brooklyn Slugga had just won 2 Grammys. And he felt unstoppable. The A1 Entertainment Grammy party lasted until almost sunrise. Champagne bottles filled the tables. Producers, executives, rappers, athletes and influencers stopped by Tony's section. Chrissy documented almost everything. She held her phone toward Tony. "Tell them." Tony laughed. "Tell them what?" "2-time Grammy winner." Tony held both trophies toward the camera. "Brooklyn, we did it." Chrissy kissed his cheek. James climbed onto the platform near their table and raised a glass. "Everybody." The conversations stopped. James wrapped an arm around Tony. "4 years ago, I told this man I was gonna make him a superstar." People applauded. 2 platinum albums. More applause. 2 Grammys. People cheered. "And now we're about to give y'all album number 3 and another world tour." Tony raised his glass. James continued. "And after that, we're gonna sit down and make sure Brooklyn Slugga stays right where he belongs." James smiled. With A1 Entertainment, everybody cheered. Tony drank. Everybody seemed happy. Except D-Nice. Tony noticed him sitting near the end of the section. D-Nice looked over. "You good?" "I'm good." Tony walked over. "You don't look good." D-Nice glanced toward James. "Not tonight." Tony laughed. "Man, I just won 2 Grammys. If something wrong, tell me." D-Nice looked at the trophies. "Enjoy tonight." "What you talking about?" "Tomorrow we need to talk business." Tony frowned. "What business?" D-Nice looked directly at him. "Your business." 2 days later, Tony was back in the studio. The Grammys were sitting at home. The suit was gone. The cameras were gone. It was just Tony, D-Nice and Dre. They were listening to beats for the 3rd album. D-Nice stopped the track. "How much publishing you got?" Tony looked at him. "What? Your publishing? What about it? How much you own?" Tony shrugged. "James handles that." D-Nice looked at Dre. Dre leaned back. Tony noticed. "Why you all looking at each other like that?" D-Nice asked another question. "You own your masters." Tony hesitated. "The label owns the albums." "That's not what I asked." Tony became defensive. "That's how deals work. Sometimes." D-Nice leaned forward. "But what percentage of your publishing you own?" Tony didn't answer. Dre finally spoke. "You ever read your contract?" "Of course I read it. All of it." Tony stared at him. Dre nodded. "That's what I thought." Tony stood. "So now I'm stupid." D-Nice shook his head. "Ain't nobody calling you stupid." "Sounds like it." "I'm saying you became a rapper before you became a businessman." That sentence stayed with Tony. D-Nice continued. "You got 2 platinum albums, Slugga. You just won 2 Grammys. You're selling shows overseas. Your records stay on the radio." He paused. "Where's the money?" Tony laughed. "I got money." "That's not what I asked." The room became quiet. D-Nice looked at his friend. "How much money did Brooklyn Slugga generate?" Tony didn't know. "And how much of it belongs to Tony Roberts?" Tony didn't know that either. A week later, Tony sat across from Elizabeth Gonzalez. Everybody in the entertainment industry called her Legal Lizzie. Lizzie had negotiated recording contracts, publishing deals, endorsement agreements and corporate acquisitions. She wasn't impressed by celebrities. That was one of the first things Tony noticed. He arrived with an assistant carrying boxes. Lizzie looked at them. "What's that?" "My contracts." "All of them?" "I think." Lizzie leaned back. "You think?" Tony smiled awkwardly. "That's why I'm here." Lizzie didn't smile. "Mr. Roberts, before we start, I need you to understand something." "What's that?" "I'm your lawyer. Not your friend. Not your manager. Not your fan." Tony nodded. "My job is to tell you the truth, including when the truth is that you made a bad decision." "Fair enough." She opened the first folder. "Then let's find out what you signed. Over the next several weeks, Lizzie and her team went through everything. The recording agreement, publishing agreements, management agreements, touring documents, merchandising, brand partnerships, licensing, royalty statements. Tony quickly learned something. Being successful and understanding the business of your success were two completely different things. One afternoon Lizzie called him into her office. Dre came with him. Lizzie placed several documents on the table. How much do you believe you've generated during the last 4 years? Tony gave her a number. Lizzie looked at him. You're low. How low? Very. Tony sat forward. Lizzie began explaining. Some arrangements were legitimate industry agreements Tony simply hadn't understood. Others raised questions. Payments had gone to management-related entities. Expenses appeared unusually high. Tour settlements didn't always match the reports Tony had received. There were publishing arrangements Tony didn't fully understand. His masters were controlled by the record company, and James had been receiving substantial compensation throughout the process. Tony rubbed his face. Did he steal from me? Lizzie chose her words carefully. I'm not making that accusation until we can prove it. So what are you saying? I'm saying we need a forensic accountant. Tony looked toward Dre. Dre shook his head. Damn. Lizzie pushed another document toward Tony. There's something else. Tony looked at it. You owe the label another album. I know. Then don't do anything stupid. Tony looked up. What does that mean? It means don't get angry and walk away. Don't go online. Don't threaten anybody. Don't breach your agreement. So what do I do? Lizzie closed the folder. You fulfill your obligations. Then she looked directly at him. And while you're doing that, you learn your business. While Tony was learning his business, he started paying attention to his marriage. Chrissy had been with him for 3 years before they married. She had watched Brooklyn Slugga go from local rapper to international celebrity. Her own career had grown to 2 million followers. Fashion campaigns, beauty endorsements, paid appearances. Mercedes, her younger sister, coordinated much of her brand. From the outside, Tony and Chrissy were hip-hop royalty. Inside their home, something had changed. Chrissy had become colder. When Tony returned from tour, she seemed irritated rather than excited. When he worked late, she accused him of choosing music over his marriage. Tony initially blamed himself. Then he noticed something else. James sometimes knew about private conversations Tony had only had with Chrissy. At first, Tony dismissed it. Then came the hotel charge. A location. A date. A lie. Tony called Lizzie. I need somebody. For what? I need to know something about my wife. Lizzie was silent. You sure? No. Then why do it? Because I need to be sure. A private investigator was hired. Tony hated himself for it. For almost 2 weeks, nothing happened. Then his phone rang. The investigator wanted to meet. Tony already knew. Sometimes your heart accepts the truth before your mind sees the evidence. The photographs were placed on the table. Chrissy. James. Another photograph. Another date. Another location. Then records suggesting it wasn't new. The relationship appeared to stretch back nearly 2 years. Tony stared at the photographs. He didn't yell. He didn't flip the table. He didn't call James. He didn't call Chrissy. He simply sat there. That night Tony returned to the studio alone. He turned off the lights, sat behind the mixing console, and cried. Not Brooklyn Slugga. Tony Roberts. The man who had thanked his wife and manager on national television. The man who had trusted both of them. He finally understood why betrayal hurt differently when it came from people you loved. Tony gave James a chance first. They met at A1 Entertainment. Tony sat across from the man who had managed him for 4 years. James, is my money right? James laughed. What kind of question is that? Simple question. Who been talking to you? Nobody. Somebody been talking. Tony remained calm. I'm asking you. James leaned back. Everything I've done has been for your career. That's not what I asked. James's voice rose. You walked into this business not knowing nothing. Who got you meetings? Who got you the deal? Who got you on tour? Tony watched him. James continued. Now you win 2 Grammys and suddenly you questioning me. Tony nodded slowly. Okay. Okay, what? Nothing. Tony stood. James pointed toward him. Don't let people get in your head, Slugga. Tony stopped at the door. I won't. Then he left. Chrissy got her chance that night. They sat in their bedroom. Tony looked at his wife. You happy? Chrissy looked confused. What? With me? Why are you asking me that? Just answer. Chrissy put down her phone. Tony, I'm tired. Anything you need to tell me. Her expression changed. Like what? Anything. Why are you questioning me? I'm talking to my wife. No. You're interrogating me. Tony looked at her for several seconds. Chrissy shook her head. Maybe you need to worry about what you do when you're on the road instead of questioning me. Tony felt something break inside him. He knew exactly what she meant. James had told her he was cheating. The investigator had already uncovered messages showing James repeatedly feeding Chrissy stories about Tony having women in different cities. None of it was true. But Tony also knew something else. James's lies might explain how the affair began. They didn't explain 2 years of deception. Tony stood. Good night, Chrissy. She looked at him strangely. Where are you going? Studio. James expected Tony's 3rd album to be his masterpiece. He promoted the album heavy on social media. Secretly he was expecting a big payday. The label advance was $1.5 million. Tony gave him an album. Nothing more. He showed up. He recorded. He fulfilled his obligations. But the hunger was missing. D-Nice noticed immediately. You sure about this? Tony stood inside the booth. Contract says I owe them an album. He grunted. Yeah, D-Nice said, turning a knob on the mixing board. I'm giving them an album. Tony smiled almost sarcastically. The project had only 2 guest features. Tony recorded 2 singles that performed well largely because Brooklyn Slugga's name could still move records. But Tony knew the financial structure meant he would see relatively little from them compared with the money they generated. James complained constantly. We need another record. You got 12. We need a hit. You got 2 singles. I need Slugga. Tony stared at him. You got him. No, I got Tony Roberts showing up to work. Tony almost smiled. For once, James was right. What James didn't know was that after those sessions ended, Tony sometimes drove to another studio. A small private facility that D-Nice and Dre just acquired for a good price. This was gonna be the new studio and offices for Genesis Media Group. Dre was there. D-Nice was there. Lizzie handled the legal structure. Number A1 employees. No James. No label representatives. No Chrissy. Tony paid for the building himself. And inside that studio, Brooklyn Slugga came alive again. He wrote about betrayal, ownership, friendship, fear, money, love, Brooklyn, success. He wrote one song about realizing that the person sleeping beside you could become a stranger. He wrote another about a man smiling beside you while reaching into your pocket. But he also wrote about himself. Because Tony finally admitted that James hadn't forced him to ignore his contracts. Tony had chosen not to learn. He understood at the time he was just a kid trying to get a record deal. That realization changed the album. It stopped being a revenge project. It became an ownership project. Dre looked at the paperwork. So this really you? Lizzie corrected him. Yours and Tony's. Dre laughed. What you mean yours and Tony's? Tony sat across from him. I want you with me. I'm already with you. Not formal with me. Tony pushed the paperwork toward him. We gonna build this together. Dre looked down at the paperwork. I want you to be co-CEO of Genesis Media Group. Dre stared at Tony. You serious? You've been there since before anybody cared. That don't mean you owe me a company. I don't. Tony smiled. That's why I'm offering it. Dre extended his hand. Tony ignored it and hugged him. D-Nice watched from the couch. So what I get? Tony laughed. You get paid for them beats. That's cold. D-Nice said, shaking his head. Everyone laughed. For the first time in months, Tony felt normal. Lizzie gathered the documents. We still have work to do. Tony looked at her. You always ruin the moment. That's why you pay me. Dre looked at Tony. You paying her? Lizzie looked at Dre. You want me to review that co-CEO agreement or not? Dre immediately became serious. Ms. Gonzalez, would you like some coffee? Everybody laughed again. Tony looked around the room. Something was different. Nobody there needed Brooklyn Slugga to be famous. They cared whether Tony was okay. He had spent years surrounded by people. Now he was learning the difference between having people around you and having people with you. Album 3 was released. It wasn't terrible. It wasn't great. Critics noticed the difference. Some said Slugga had become comfortable. Others wondered whether fame had taken away his hunger. James was furious. He really didn't want to release the album, but a big label had a schedule to keep. That third album fulfilled Tony's contractual recording obligation to A1 Entertainment and the label that James had the distribution deal with. The final performance of the album promo cycle took place in New York. Tony walked onto the stage knowing James was backstage. Chrissy was there too. Their marriage was barely functioning. She still didn't know what Tony knew about her and James. Near the end of the show, Tony had the DJ stop the music. Tony walked toward the front of the stage. Thousands of phones rose into the air. New York. The crowd screamed. I got something I need to tell you all. The arena quieted. 4 years ago, y'all gave a kid from Brooklyn a life he couldn't imagine. The crowd cheered. 2 platinum albums. 2 Grammys. Countries I never thought I'd see. Tony paused. And I appreciate everybody who helped me get here. James smiled backstage. Then Tony continued. But tonight is more than just the end of a promo tour. James's smile disappeared. He didn't know where Tony was going with that statement. Tonight is the last night Brooklyn Slugga performs under somebody else's umbrella. The arena exploded. James stepped closer to the monitor. Chrissy looked toward him. Tony smiled. My contract is complete. This is the last album under A1 Entertainment. The crowd got louder. From now on, Brooklyn Slugga is officially independent. Dre hugged D-Nice. They laughed and dapped each other up backstage. Lizzie simply smiled. Tony wasn't finished. From now on, it's G.M.G. The Genesis Media Group company logo appeared on the giant screen. James cursed. He had a confused look on his face. He wasn't expecting his number artist to leave. He thought he was gonna resign with A1. And if y'all think I'm taking a break, Tony laughed and then paused for a moment. I got another album coming. The crowd erupted. James stormed toward the stage entrance. Lizzie stepped directly in front of him. Don't. James glared at her. Get out my way. Lizzie didn't move. Dre walked up and stood behind her. D-Nice chuckled. You got your 3 albums. You got paid off, my boy. Now it's time for him to do his thing. Lizzie smiled. Exactly. By Monday morning, the letters started arriving. Cease and desist notices. Threatened lawsuits. Claims involving recordings. Questions about intellectual property. James argued that material Tony had created during his contract belonged to A1 Entertainment. Lizzie disagreed. She argued that once Tony turned in the 3rd album and the label accepted it and released it, Tony's business with the label was complete. Lizzie team then went on the offensive. They demanded complete documentation from the label and James. Royalty statements. Tour records. Management payments. Publishing records. The forensic accountant had spent months following the money. While all that was going on, Tony also filed for divorce. The private investigators' evidence became part of the larger legal strategy where relevant. But Lizzie warned Tony against turning the case into public revenge. We win with documents. Tony wanted to release everything. Lizzie stopped him. You want revenge or your business? Both. Pick one. Tony stared at her. Lizzie continued. Revenge makes you emotional. Business makes you patient. Tony sat down. Business. Good answer. DJ Dream had interviewed Brooklyn Slugga since his first album. When rumors of the split from A1 spread, every radio station wanted to interview Tony. Tony chose DJ Dream. The studio was packed. It was early in the morning, but Slugga was full of energy. Dream leaned toward the microphone. New York, we got Brooklyn Slugga in the building. Tony smiled. What's good, bro? Man, everybody wants to know what's happening. Life? Dream laughed. Don't do that. You announced you were leaving A1 and starting your own label in front of 20,000 people. What's the name of the new label? Is it an imprint of a larger label? Come on, bro, give me the business. Tony laughed. The new label is called Genesis Media Group. We are totally independent. We got a distribution deal with Empire. Tony said, playing with his newly acquired GMG chain. Who's running it? Me and my brother Dre. Dream nodded. And who's managing Brooklyn Slugga now? Tony looked through the glass. Lizzie was standing outside the studio. Tony smiled. Somebody who actually works for Brooklyn Slugga. Lizzie shook her head. Dream laughed. I heard it was legal, Lizzie. So your lawyer is your manager. She's still my attorney. But she's helping oversee the business and management team. Dream turned toward the camera. James Draper is somewhere throwing a chair right now. Tony laughed but didn't respond. Dream became serious. Did James steal from you? Tony paused. My lawyers are handling that. Did your wife have a relationship with him? Another pause. I don't want to even go into that, bro. Dream nodded. Fair. Tony appreciated that. Dream changed the subject. Let's talk music. Dream nodded. Let's do it. You really got a new album already in the works. Tony smiled. We brought you the single. Dream looked surprised. For real, stop playing. He signaled to his program director to see if they truly had it. The program director gave him the signal that the song was loaded into his console. DJ Dream pressed play. For the first time anywhere in the world, the lead single from Brooklyn Slugga's independent album came through the speakers and hit the airways. Dream listened for 30 seconds. Then he stopped it. He looked at Tony. Oh, you're angry. Tony laughed. Nah. Dream restarted the record. But this time he gave the record a proper introduction. You definitely angry. Tony didn't expose Chrissy. He didn't have to. The divorce filing became public. Then information about James surfaced. Podcasts started talking. Social media exploded. Old photographs were examined. Timelines were built. People noticed how often James and Chrissy had been in the same places while Tony was touring. Chrissy's comment sections became brutal. Mercedes watched her sister unravel. You need to get offline. I can't. Yes, you can. They're calling me everything. Mercedes took the phone. Then stopped reading it. Chrissy started crying. He lied to me. Who? James. Mercedes already knew. He kept telling me Tony had women. Did you ever ask Tony? Chrissy didn't answer. Mercedes looked at her sister. Did you? I thought James had proof. But you stayed with James for 2 years. Chrissy looked away. Mercedes softened her voice. I'm your sister. I love you. Chrissy wiped her face. But James lying to you doesn't make everything you did disappear. That was the part Chrissy wasn't ready to accept. The independent album was titled Own Yours. No giant label rollout. Tony and Dre handled the rollout. D-Nice handled the DJs and radio. No James Draper. Genesis Media Group partnered with Empire Distribution. They retained 80% control over the recordings. Tony owned what he had created. The album dropped at midnight a week after the radio interview. By morning, it was everywhere. 5 songs became major hits. But two records dominated the conversation. The first song, called Who Do You Love, was about Chrissy. Tony never said her name. He didn't need to. It wasn't disrespectful. That made it hurt more. He talked about sleeping beside someone who had already emotionally left. About coming home from tour believing he was returning to love. About realizing the same person kissing him goodbye knew exactly where she was going after he left. The second song was different. It was aimed at James. Not with threats. With receipts. Contracts. Percentages. Ownership. A young artist who thought fame meant wealth. A manager who understood that ignorance could be profitable. The hook became a phrase repeated everywhere. Own yours before somebody else does. Artists posted it. Athletes posted it. Entrepreneurs posted it. The phrase became bigger than the song. And for the first time in his career, Tony understood exactly where his money was going. Chrissy eventually went on a podcast and talked about the whole situation. She cried during the interview. She admitted she had the relationship with James. But she also told her side. According to Chrissy, James had spent months convincing her Tony was cheating. He told her there were women in London, Atlanta, Los Angeles, even Miami. He claimed he had protected Tony by keeping stories away from blogs. Chrissy believed him. At first. She said she was angry, lonely, vulnerable. And James was always there. Then the relationship crossed a line. Then another. Eventually she was living two lives. The host asked the question everyone wanted answered. Do you still love Tony? Chrissy cried. Yes. Do you want your husband back? Yes. The clip went viral. Tony watched it once. Then turned it off. Chrissy asked to see him. Tony initially refused. Lizzie told him the decision was his. Dre told him not to go. D-Nice told him to do whatever gave him peace. Tony agreed to meet. They sat across from each other in a private room. For several seconds neither spoke. Chrissy finally broke the silence. I'm sorry. Tony nodded. I know. No, Tony. I'm really sorry. I know. James manipulated me. Tony looked at her. I know that too. He told me you were cheating everywhere you went. I wasn't. I know now. Tony leaned back. Chrissy started crying. He made me believe you didn't care about me anymore. Tony remained calm. Maybe James lied to you about me. Chrissy nodded. Tony continued. But you lied to me about you. She looked down. I made a mistake. 2 years isn't a mistake. Chrissy wiped her eyes. I want my husband. Tony looked at the woman he had once imagined growing old with. Part of him still loved her. That was what made the answer difficult. I forgive you. Chrissy looked up hopefully. But I'm not coming back. Her face changed. Tony. I don't hate you. Then why can't we fix it? Because forgiveness and trust aren't the same thing. Chrissy cried. Tony stood. I hope you find peace. What about us? Tony looked at her. There ain't an us anymore. Then he walked away. The legal battle lasted longer than Tony expected. James fought everything. The label fought ownership claims. Lawyers argued over contracts Tony wished he had understood 4 years earlier. But forensic accounting had uncovered discrepancies that couldn't simply be explained away. Negotiations followed. Then more negotiations. Some claims were settled. Some money was recovered. He started his own publishing company through GMG. Tony eventually secured control of important portions of his catalog and negotiated rights that gave him greater long-term control over his earlier work. He didn't get everything. Lizzie had warned him he probably wouldn't. But Tony got something more important. He understood every agreement he signed from that point forward. One afternoon James and Tony crossed paths. James gave him a look of disgust. As they passed he shook his head at Tony. You think they love you? Tony stopped. He turned and looked at James. James continued. Everybody around you getting paid off you. Tony smiled. Yeah. So what's different? James said with a condescending look on his face. Tony looked at him. The difference is I know how. James stared at him. Tony continued. I know how much. I know why. I know where it goes. And I know what I own when it's over. James didn't respond. Tony walked away. He didn't need revenge. James had taught him the most expensive lesson of his life. Tony intended to make sure he never paid tuition twice. A year earlier, Tony had walked into the Grammys with music he didn't control. This time was different. His fourth album had multiple nominations. Dre sat beside him. D-Nice was nearby. Lizzie sat on the other side. Tony looked down the row. No James, no Chrissy. The presenter opened the envelope. And the Grammy goes to Brooklyn Slugga. Tony closed his eyes. Grammy number 1. Later came another. Then another. 3 Grammys. All from the independent album. When Tony accepted the third award, he stood behind the microphone for a long moment. Then he smiled. My first time standing up here, I thanked a lot of people. The audience became quiet. Some deserved it. Dre laughed. So tonight I'm gonna keep this simple. Tony looked toward his team. Dre. Dre nodded. D-Nice. D-Nice raised his fist. Lizzie. Lizzie smiled. To my entire team over at Genesis Media Group, this is just one of many we gonna win together. Tony looked at the trophy. And to everybody or anybody that ever created something. He paused. Learn your business. Applause started. Love the art. Love the music. Love the dream. Tony looked directly into the camera. But own yours. The audience stood. The success of the album changed Genesis Media Group. With the first release doing so well, it became one of the top independent labels in the game. Tony was no longer simply an independent rapper. He was becoming an executive. Young artists wanted meetings. They wanted to be a part of the roster of artists for the next generation. Producers sent beats to D-Nice in hopes of getting on any upcoming projects. Brands wanted deals. Tony thought about all the brands that wanted to do deals with him. He decided to link up with a fellow entrepreneur from Brooklyn named Blitz Santiago. He was from Flatbush. They would often run into each other when they both ran the streets. They came from different crews, but they had always respected each other. Blitz had become a mogul in his own right, handling everything from real estate, corporate rent-a-cars, and just did a deal to open a chain of steakhouses in New York, Atlanta, Charlotte and Columbia, South Carolina. He was stepping into the field of fashion. He started his clothing line called the One Life Collection. Tony and Blitz agreed on a $3 million deal for Tony to endorse, promote, and develop the fashion brand. Then Hollywood called. A producer wanted Tony for a supporting role in an upcoming movie. Another company wanted him to develop a streaming series. Dre walked into Tony's office holding a folder. You gonna act now? Tony laughed. Maybe. Dre sat down. I got a better idea. What? Tony said, putting down the script he was reviewing. We produce. Tony looked at him. Dre continued. We got our own situation. The label is popping, so why build somebody else's movie company? Tony smiled. Lizzie walked into the room. No. Both men looked at her. Tony laughed. You don't even know what we talking about. Yes, I do. Every time both of you have that look, it costs money. Dre pointed toward her. See why I don't like lawyers. Lizzie placed documents on the desk. Genesis Film and TV. Tony stared at her. You already did it. No. I prepared the corporate outline because I knew eventually one of you would say something ridiculous like, why don't we make movies? Dre looked at Tony. I love her. Tony laughed. So do I. The room became quiet. Lizzie looked at Tony. Tony quickly corrected himself. I mean professionally. Dre started laughing. Lizzie shook her head. Sign the damn paperwork, Tony. But something had changed between Tony and Lizzie. Not romance. Not yet. Trust. During the worst period of his life, Lizzie had never told Tony what he wanted to hear simply because he was Brooklyn Slugga. She told him when he was wrong. She told him when to wait. She told him when a deal wasn't good enough. And most importantly, she never asked him for anything outside of what they agreed upon. For Tony, that was rare. Months later, Tony sat inside his Brooklyn penthouse looking across the city. The television was off. No music was playing. 3 Grammys from Own Yours sat on a shelf across the room. His original 2 Grammys were there too. 5 Grammys. But Tony wasn't looking at them. He was looking through the windows at Brooklyn. Dre and D-Nice had just left after a business meeting. The company was expanding. Genesis Film and TV had its first internet series project in development. Tony had another real estate property closing the following week. His streaming platform audience continued growing. And for the first time in years, Tony wasn't chasing anything. Lizzie walked through the room gathering her laptop and folders. "You know we have a meeting tomorrow morning." Tony continued looking through the window. "What meeting?" Lizzie stopped. 9 o'clock. "That doesn't tell me what meeting. You said you wanted to meet about a documentary you want to do." Tony turned around. "Oh." Lizzie stared at him. "Oh." Tony laughed. "I got a lot going on." "You wanted to make movies." "I do." "Then don't be late." Tony smiled. "Yes, ma'am." Lizzie walked toward the door. "Lizzie." She stopped. "Thank you." "For what?" Tony thought about the question. "For showing up." Lizzie smiled. "That's my job." "Nah." Tony shook his head. "It stopped being just your job a long time ago." Lizzie looked at him. Neither said anything for a moment. Then she smiled. 9 o'clock, CEO. Tony laughed. "Good night, Lizzie." "Good night, Mr. Roberts." She smiled. She left. Tony turned back toward the window. There had been a time when hearing Brooklyn Slugga on the radio was enough. Then success became platinum albums. Then sold-out arenas. Then Grammys. Then money. Tony had spent years believing those things meant he had made it. But success had taught him a strange lesson. You could sell millions of records and not own the records. You could generate millions of dollars and not understand where the money went. You could have millions of followers and still be surrounded by people you couldn't trust. You could sleep beside someone every night and still not know them. Tony had lost money. He had lost his marriage. He had lost friendships he once believed would last forever. And there were pieces of his early catalog he might never completely control. But he wasn't bitter. Strangely, Tony was thankful. James had forced him to learn the business. Chrissy had forced him to understand the difference between love and loyalty. The label had taught him the importance of ownership. D-Nice and Dre had shown him what friendship looked like when there was nothing to gain. And Lizzie had shown him that trust didn't have to come with an agenda. Tony walked toward the shelf. He picked up one of the Grammys from his independent album. His reflection appeared in the gold surface. 4 years, Brooklyn Slugga had been the product. Everybody got a piece. The label, management, promoters, even publishers. People Tony didn't even know. But things were different now. The music was his. The company was his. The decisions were his. And most importantly, Tony Roberts finally belonged to himself. His phone buzzed. A message from Dre. "Don't forget the meeting tomorrow." Lizzie said if we're late she's starting without us. Tony laughed. He typed back. "She ain't starting my company meeting without me." Dre immediately responded. "Our company. You still earning?" Tony laughed harder. He put the phone down. Outside the window, Brooklyn stretched across the horizon. The same city where a kid named Tony Roberts once sat in a basement holding a microphone wire because the microphone would stop working if he let it go. That kid wanted the world to know his name. The world eventually did. But somewhere along the way, Tony had almost forgotten the kid behind the name. Not anymore. He raised the Grammy slightly toward the Brooklyn skyline. "Own yours." Tony smiled. Then he placed the trophy back on the shelf. Tomorrow there would be meetings. Contracts. Music. Movies. Business. Maybe even another album. But tonight there was peace. And after everything Tony Roberts had been through, peace was the award. The end. Thank you for listening. I hope you like stories by Blitz Santiago. Be sure to follow my socials. Connect with me and tell me what kind of stories you would like to hear. If you like stories that make you root for the underdog, like, share, and subscribe to the channel. We have plenty more stories of courage, strength, the underdog not giving up. Until next time.